Chapter 1. The Descent. The night sky over the Thar Desert was usually a canvas of static diamonds, but on this Tuesday, the heavens tore open. A streak of emerald fire bifurcated the horizon, silent and predatory. It didn't burn with the chaotic orange of a meteorite. It pulsed with a rhythmic, intelligent luminescence. In the nearby village of Kuldhara, the livestock went silent. Dr. Mira Singh, stationed at a remote atmospheric research outpost, watched her sensors spike into the red. "It's not a rock," she whispered, her fingers flying across the console. "The deceleration is controlled." The impact was less of an explosion and more of a sigh. A massive shockwave of green light rippled outward, knocking Mira to the floor as her monitors dissolved into static. When she scrambled to a window a mile away, a pillar of verdant light reached toward the stars, anchoring the earth to the sky. Chapter 2, The Cradle. The green ball, as the media would soon call it, was 10 meters in diameter and composed of material that defied periodic classification. It wasn't metal, nor was it organic, but it thrummed with a low-frequency vibration that Mira could feel in her teeth. By dawn, the Indian Army had cordoned off the site, but Myra's credentials as the lead researcher on the scene kept her at the front. She approached the sphere with a handheld scanner. As she touched the surface, the texture shifted from cold glass to something resembling warm skin. A seam opened, not through mechanical hinges, but through a molecular parting. Inside, suspended in a translucent gel, sat a figure. It possessed the silhouette of a human youth, but its skin was a pale iridescent olive, and its eyes, when they finally opened, held the depth of an ancient nebula. Chapter 3. The First Pulse. The entity did not speak. Instead, it projected. Mira felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind her eyes, followed by a rush of imagery: dying suns, fractured planets, and a looming shadow that devoured light itself. "Aris," she gasped, the name forming in her mind not as a sound, but as an identity. Outside the containment tent, the world was reacting with less curiosity and more terror. General Verma paced the perimeter, his radio buzzing with frantic orders from New Delhi and Washington. "Doctor, step away," Verma commanded, his hand on his sidearm. "It's communicating, General," Mira shouted back. But to the satellite feeds and the soldiers' thermal goggles, the green pulse looked like a weapon charging. As Aris reached out a hand toward Mira, the general saw an attack. He raised his weapon, and the first shot of potential intergalactic war rang out into the desert air. Chapter 4. The Sound of Misunderstanding. The bullet didn't strike Aris. Instead, it slowed as it entered the verdant aura surrounding the sphere, losing momentum until it fell harmlessly into sand like a spent toy. To Mira, it was an act of grace. To General Verma, it was a display of superior, terrifying defensive technology. "Cease fire," Mira screamed, throwing herself between the soldiers and the open craft. It didn't fight back. It just protected itself. Aris stepped out of the gel, his feet hovering an inch above the scorched earth. He looked at the soldiers, not with malice, but with profound, weary sadness. The air around him shimmered, and a low, melodic hum began to vibrate through the ground. It was a frequency that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the nervous system, inducing a sense of overwhelming calm in Mira, but triggering a primal flight-or-fight response in the high-strung military personnel. "He's disarming us," Varma growled, struggling to lift his heavy rifle against the invisible psychic weight. "It's a wide-area neural weapon. Sector 4, engage the dampeners." Across the globe, the feed from a surreptitious drone was being broadcast into the situation rooms of every superpower. They didn't see a messenger. They saw an apex predator capable of neutralizing a battalion without lifting a finger. The misunderstanding was no longer local. It was planetary. Chapter 5. The Fragmented Vision. Inside the makeshift medical bay, Aris allowed Mira to conduct basic scans. The results were impossible. His DNA was a double helix, yet it was woven with synthetic strands that functioned like fiber optic cables. He was a bridge, a biological record of two worlds. "Why are you here?" Mira whispered, pressing a cold compress to her head to dull the telepathic noise. Aris reached out, his long, slender fingers hovering near her temple. Suddenly, the tent vanished. Mira wasn't in the desert anymore. She was floating in the vacuum of space. She saw Earth, blue and fragile, but something was wrong. A massive, jagged rift was opening in the fabric of the solar system, a gravitational anomaly that made the sun flicker like a dying bulb. The great silence, Aris's voice echoed in her mind, sounding like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. Your transit through the cosmic veil has triggered a collapse. You are not being invaded by us. You are being erased by the universe. The vision flickered. She saw cities crumbling, not from bombs, but from the literal unraveling of physics. Then the vision snapped. Mira was back in the tent, gasping for air. Aris looked weaker, his olive skin fading to a dull gray. The effort to communicate across the biological divide was killing him. Chapter 6. The Escalation. The Indian government was under immense pressure. The United States and China had both moved carrier strike groups into the Arabian Sea, demanding joint custody of the extraterrestrial asset. Within the camp, the atmosphere had soured. Science was no longer the priority. Containment and extraction were. Dr. Singh, you are being relieved, Verma announced. Flanked by a specialized tactical team wearing lead-line suits designed to block telepathic influence. The entity is being moved to a subsurface facility in Ugratla. High-value asset protocols are in effect. You can't move him. Mira protested. He's unstable, and he's trying to tell us about a celestial event. We have months, maybe weeks, before the gravitational rift reaches our orbit. Verma didn't listen. He saw a scientist who had fallen under the spell of an invader. As the tactical team moved in with electrified capture nets, Aris's eyes glowed a fierce, desperate emerald. He emitted a pulse so strong it knocked out the power grid for 3 neighboring provinces. In the darkness that followed, the world saw the blackout, not as a cry for help, but as an act of war. The Green Messenger had just been reclassified by the UN Security Council as a global extinction threat. Chapter 7. The Underground Network. As the military transport convoy prepared to move Aris, Mira realized she was no longer an observer. She was a conspirator. Under the cover of the massive blackout, she met with Dr. Aris Van, a linguist, and Captain Covey, a young officer who had seen the sadness in the hybrid's eyes. They gathered in the shadow of a radar dish, the desert wind whipping sand against their faces. They're going to dissect him, Mira said, her voice trembling. They think they can harvest his weaponry. But there is no weapon. There's only a warning we are too deaf to hear. Covey checked his watch. The transport leaves in 20 minutes. If we're going to move, it has to be now. I have a specialized medical transport that hasn't been logged into the main manifest. We can divert him to a private observatory in the Western Ghats. It was treason, but Mira didn't hesitate. She knew that if Aris died in a cage, the secret of humanity's survival would die with him. They weren't just saving an alien. They were stealing the only map to a future. Chapter 8. The Great Panic. The news of the regional blackout triggered a domino effect of global hysteria. In New York, the stock exchange halted as investors fled toward hard assets. In London and Tokyo, streets were choked with families trying to flee urban centers, even though there was nowhere to hide from a threat they didn't understand. The media, starved for facts, filled the void with speculation. Tabloids ran headlines about the Green Plague, while religious cults declared the end of days. Every satellite launch was viewed as a potential missile, and every diplomatic silence was interpreted as a preparation for strike. In the midst of this, a video leaked. It was a grainy, high-angle shot of Aris being forced into a containment unit. His body glowed with a rhythmic, pulsing light. The narrator claimed the alien was charging a planetary pulse. The truth, that Aris was actually crying out in physiological distress, was lost in the noise of a world convinced of its own martyrdom. Chapter 9. The Broken Sky. The escape was a blur of adrenaline and dust. Covey's team managed to intercept the transport during a scheduled fuel stop, using a localized EMP to disable the escort vehicles. Mira scrambled into the back of the medical van. Finding Aris curled in a fetal position, his iridescent skin translucent enough to see the shimmering gold of his circulatory system. "We're going to help you," she whispered, touching his hand. Aris's eyes flickered open. He didn't speak, but the air in the van grew cold. Suddenly, the roof of the van seemed to turn transparent, a psychic projection of the sky above. Mira looked up and saw it. The rift Aris had warned about. It wasn't a physical hole yet, but a distortion of the stars, like a lens cap being twisted. The constellations were shifting. Orion's belt was stretching, the stars pulling away from each other as the gravitational anomaly began to tug at the fabric of their local space. It was beautiful and horrific. It has begun, the voice echoed in her mind. The messenger is late, and the audience is screaming. Chapter 10, The Sanctuary of Silence. The Western Ghats rose like jagged teeth against the horizon as the medical van wound its way up the mist-shrouded peaks. Their destination was the Amrita Observatory, an aging facility tucked away from the prying eyes of satellite surveillance. Dr. Aris Van had secured the site, claiming it was for a classified environmental study. As they wheeled Aris into the cooling air of the dome, the hybrid's breathing became more rhythmic. The high altitude and the distance from the military's heavy radio jamming allowed his consciousness to expand. He didn't need the gel anymore. He stood on his own, his feet brushing the cold stone floor. The resonance is clearer here, Aris projected, his voice no longer a scream, but a steady hum. The Earth's crust is thin at this coordinate. I can feel the planet's heartbeat. It is accelerating. The Earth knows the rift is coming. Mira watched the monitors. The seismic sensors were picking up microtremors from across the globe. It wasn't tectonic plate movement. It was a gravitational tidal pull from deep space. The world was being stretched, and Aris was the only one who knew how to brace for the snap. Chapter 11, The Global Manhunt. In the war rooms of the Pentagon in New Delhi, the disappearance of Aris was treated as a level red security breach. General Verma was under fire. You lost a biological entity of unknown power in the middle of the desert. The defense minister roared over secure line. The Americans think we've hidden him to weaponize him. The Russians are moving their subs. Find him, or we are at war with our own neighbors before the alien even blinks. A massive surveillance net was cast. AI algorithms began scanning every thermal signature and satellite image of the Indian subcontinent. They weren't looking for a van. They were looking for the green signature, the specific electromagnetic radiation Aris emitted when stressed. By midnight, a high-altitude drone picked up a faint emerald glow emanating from the Western Ghats. The military didn't send a recovery team this time. They sent a strike force. The order was clear. If the asset cannot be contained, it must be neutralized to prevent it from falling into enemy hands or triggering whatever weapon it was perceived to hold. Chapter 12, The Language of Light. Inside the observatory, Mira and Aris Van worked feverishly to bridge the communication gap. Aris wasn't just a messenger. He was a biological transmitter. He explained that his home was a collective of civilizations that had seen this rift destroy thousands of worlds. It is a pocket of vacuum decay, Aris communicated, showing them a terrifying geometric visualization on the observatory's main screen. Your planet's heavy use of high-energy experiments and nuclear testing has thinned the local space-time. You called the shadow to your door. How do we stop it? Mira asked, her heart hammering. We do not stop the universe, Aris replied, his eyes glowing with a sudden, intense light. We must redirect the energy. I can act as a lens, but I need a global broadcast. I need the energy of your entire communication grid to create a counterpulse. But your leaders, they are preparing to fire. As he spoke, the sound of rhythmic thumping echoed through the valley. Black Hawk helicopters were cresting the mountain ridges, their spotlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of angry gods. The hunt was over. Chapter 13, The Siege Begins. The first flash of a flare ignited the mist outside the observatory, turning the fog into a sickly neon orange. They're here, Captain Covey whispered, checking the charge on his sidearm. He knew he couldn't fight an entire strike force, but he could buy time. The heavy iron doors of the observatory groaned as the military began using hydraulic rams. Overhead, the helicopters hovered like giant, angry insects, their downwash rattling the telescope's massive lens. Mira scrambled to the central computer hub, her fingers slick with sweat. Aris, if we do this, if we use the satellites, they'll see it as an orbital strike, Mira shouted over the roar of the engines. Aris stood in the center of the room, his olive skin now glowing with such intensity that he looked like a shard of the sun. "There is no more time for fear," Aris projected. His voice was a physical weight now, pressing against the walls of the dome. "The rift has touched your atmosphere. Look up." Mira looked at the monitors. The blue sky on the day side of the world was turning a bruised, oily purple. The stars were visible in broad daylight. The unraveling had moved from theory to catastrophe. Chapter 14, The Digital Hijack. "I need the uplink codes." Mira screamed at Aris Van. The linguist was frantically typing, bypassing firewalls that protected the Indian national satellite system. They needed more than just one bird. They needed the entire Starlink mesh and every geostationary broadcast satellite on the planet. Outside, the first breach occurred. Soldiers in gas masks and exosuits swarmed the lower levels. Covey engaged them with non-lethal flashbangs, trying to create a bottleneck in the narrow stone stairwells. "Mira, 5 minutes. That's all I can give you." Aris walked toward the main transmitter dish. He didn't use a keyboard. He simply placed his hands on the high-voltage cables. The smell of ozone filled the room. His body became a conduit, his nervous system merging with the silicon and copper of the observatory's hardware. Initiating the Great Connection, Aris hummed. Across the world, every television, smartphone, and digital billboard flickered. The military's encrypted channels were suddenly flooded with a single, repeating image: the Earth, seen through a lens of green light and the terrifying shadow of the rift closing in. Chapter 15, The Threshold of War. General Verma stood in the command center, watching his screens go dark. "He seized the network," Verma whispered, his face pale. "This is it, the first phase of the invasion. He's blinding our command and control." "Sir, the Americans are reporting the same," a technician shouted. "Global communications are down. There's a massive energy surge originating from the Western Ghats. It's pointed at the sky, sir." To a military mind, a beam of energy pointed at the sky was a weapon targeting orbital assets. Verma didn't know that the weapon was a needle meant to stitch the fabric of space back together. He saw only a threat that had finally revealed its teeth. "Authorize the kinetic strike," Verma commanded, his voice shaking. "Level the observatory. Stop that pulse before it hits the satellite belt." In the observatory, Mira saw the missile lock notification on her screen. "Aris, they're firing," she cried out. Aris didn't move. He was no longer a being of flesh. He was a pillar of pure emerald information. His consciousness spread across the planet's digital nerves, waiting for the world to either listen or burn. Chapter 16, The Voice of the Darkness. The missile was a silver needle streaking through the mountain mist, but it never reached its mark. As it entered the dome's immediate airspace, the air itself seemed to thicken into a translucent jade shield. The projectile detonated prematurely, a blossom of orange fire reflected in the emerald dome, leaving the observatory shaken but standing. Inside, the air was screaming. Aris was no longer staying on the floor. He was suspended in a web of electricity, his veins glowing like neon filaments. Suddenly, the global hijack reached its zenith. Every screen on Earth, from the jumbotrons in Times Square to the handheld devices in rural villages, ceased their static. Aris's face appeared. It wasn't the face of a monster, but a composite of 1,000 human expressions, shifting and fluid. "Children of Earth." The voice resonated, not through speakers, but inside the inner ear of every living person. "I am Aris. I am the echo of those who fell before you. I have not come to take your world, but to keep it from folding into the dark." The world froze. In the trenches of border wars and the boardrooms of empires, humanity stopped to look at the olive-skinned messenger. For the first time in history, the entire species was listening to the same breath. Chapter 17, The Siege of the Dome. While the world watched the broadcast, the local reality was far more brutal. The missile failure had prompted General Verma to send in the ground breach team. The heavy doors finally buckled and soldiers flooded the observation deck, their boots heavy on the ancient stone. "Step away from the console, Dr. Singh," a captain shouted, his laser sight dancing across Mira's chest. Mira didn't move. She stood with her arms outstretched. shielding the glowing form of Aris. "Look at the sky, Captain. Forget your orders and look at the monitors," she yelled. Behind her, the telescope's data feed showed the rift. It was no longer a distant threat. The atmosphere was beginning to bleed oxygen into the vacuum as the gravitational tide pulled at the air itself. The soldiers hesitated. They looked up to the shattered skylight of the dome. The moon was visible, but it was distorted, stretched into an oval by the invisible hands of the anomaly. The very ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with a low, mournful groan. Even the most hardened soldiers could feel it. The earth was terrified. Chapter 18. The Choice of the General. Back at the command center, General Verma watched the live feed of Mira standing defiantly against his men. He looked at the data being beamed back from his own atmospheric sensors. Mira wasn't lying. The barometric pressure was dropping globally at a rate that suggested total atmospheric collapse within hours. "Sir, the Americans are asking for coordinates to assist in the strike," an officer reported. "They want to use a tactical nuke to ensure the entity is vaporized." Verma looked at the screen, at Aris's face, which held no anger, only a desperate, pleading hope. He thought of his grandchildren in Delhi. If he fired, he might kill the invader, but he would certainly kill the planet. "Cancel the strike," Verma whispered. "Sir, I said cancel it." Verma roared, slamming his fist onto console. "Tell the Americans to stand down. We aren't fighting a war. We're witnessing a funeral, unless that doctor's right." He keyed into the local channel at the observatory. "Captain, lower your weapons." "Dr. Singh, what does he need?" Chapter 19. The Global Brain. The military's transition from aggressors to guardians happened in a heartbeat outside the observatory. The soldiers lowered their rifles, their eyes fixed on the bruised, violet sky. General Verma's voice crackled through the comms, no longer barking commands, but asking a question that carried the weight of 4 billion years of evolution. "How can we help?" Mira turned to Aris, whose body was now almost entirely composed of shimmering light. "Aris, the world is listening. What we do?" "The rift is a puncture," Aris projected. "To seal it, I need a harmonic frequency generated by your planet's entire power grid. I cannot do it alone. I need your scientists to sync their particle accelerators and power stations to the cadence I am broadcasting." Mira immediately opened a multi-way link. Within minutes, the greatest minds from CERN, NASA, and the Indian Space Research Organization were on a single, chaotic call. There was no more talk of patents, borders, or national security. There was only the math of survival. They began to pulse the global grid in a rhythmic heartbeat, turning the Earth itself into a giant tuning fork. Chapter 20. The Great Weaving. As the global power stations hummed to life, Aris's form began to expand. He drifted upward, passing to the shattered dome of the observatory. He hovered 100 feet above the mountain peak, a glowing green beacon against the encroaching darkness of the rift. The energy from the world's power grids began to flow toward him, not through wires, but through the ionosphere. From every continent, invisible ribbons of electromagnetic force converged on the Western Ghats. Aris acted as a focal point, a biological lens that gathered the frantic energy of humanity and refined it into a single, coherent beam of jade light. "Hold the frequency," Mira shouted into her headset, monitoring the structural integrity of the atmosphere. The rift was fighting back. Gravitational waves rolled across the planet, causing oceans to swell and skyscrapers to sway. It was a cosmic tug-of-war. Aris's skin began to crack, gold light leaking from the fissures in his olive flesh. The strain of channeling a planet's worth of power was tearing his physical vessel apart. Chapter 21. The Unity Pulse. For 3 minutes, the world held its breath. People in every city stepped out of their homes, watching the green aurora dance across the sky. It was the most beautiful thing humanity had ever seen, and the most terrifying. The political divisions that had pushed the world to the brink of war just hours ago seemed like playground squabbles in the face of the celestial titan above them. "I see it," Aris Van whispered, looking at the deep space telemetry. "The rift is closing. The edges are knitting back together. But the cost was high. Aris was fading. His projection on the world's screens was flickering, his composite face losing its detail. He looked down at Mira one last time, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You are capable of such light," he whispered into her mind. "Remember this. Do not wait for a catastrophe to be one people." With a final, deafening boom that sounded like a choir of stars, Aris released the stored energy. A massive ring of green light expanded from the observatory, sweeping across the globe and out into the void. When the light cleared, the sky was blue again. The rift was gone. The stars had returned to their rightful places. Chapter 22, The Silence After the Song. The silence that followed the pulse was absolute. In the Western Ghats, the hum of the observatory's cooling fans and the distant throb of helicopter rotors felt like intrusions upon a sacred space. Mira ran out onto the observation deck, her boots crunching on the glass shards of the shattered dome. Aris was no longer suspended in the air. A small, crumpled form lay on the scorched stone. The brilliant emerald glow faded to a faint, pulsing ember. Mira knelt beside him, her hands trembling. His skin was cold, the iridescent olive hue turning to a translucent white. He looked smaller, more human, and infinitely more fragile. "Is he?" General Verma's voice came from the doorway. He had arrived by transport, his uniform disheveled, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and shame. "He's exhausted," Mira whispered, checking a pulse that felt like a distant, rhythmic echo. "He gave everything to bridge the gap. He didn't just save us. He felt us. Every fear, every heartbeat of the planet ran through him." Chapter 23, The New Morning. As the sun rose over the mountains, the world woke up to a reality that had been fundamentally altered. The Green Messenger was no longer a myth or a threat. He was a martyr. Across the globe, the panic fervor for war had evaporated, replaced by a profound collective somnolence. The geopolitical tensions that threatened to ignite days prior felt like relics of a forgotten era. In the boardrooms of the UN, the conversation shifted from defense to restoration. The data Aris had shared during the Great Weaving was being analyzed by thousands of scientists. It wasn't just a warning. It was a gift, a blueprint for a new kind of energy, one that harmonized with the fabric of space rather than tearing it. However, the question of Aris's physical body remained. Military factions still lingered at the edges of the mountains, their orders superseded, but their instincts for containment still twitching. Mira knew that the sanctuary of the observatory wouldn't last forever. The world would soon come knocking, demanding to own the miracle. Chapter 24, The Departure. On the third night after the rift was sealed, the green sphere in the desert, the cradle that had brought Aris to Earth, began to glow. It didn't pulse with distress. It sang a low, melodic tone that was picked up by every seismic sensor on the planet. "It's calling him back," Aris Van realized, looking at the data. Mira sat by Aris's side in the darkened observatory. His eyes opened, the nebula-like depth returning, though dimmed. He looked at Mira and then at the sky. He didn't need telepathy for her to understand. His mission was complete. He was a messenger, and the message had been delivered with the help of Covey and Verma, who now acted as a shield against his own government. Mira transported Aris back to the impact site in the Thar Desert. As they approached the sphere, the desert sands vibrated. Aris stood up, leaning briefly on Mira's shoulder. "You chose life," he projected softly. "Keep choosing it." He stepped into the light of the sphere, and with a silent, vertical flash, the green messenger returned to the stars. Chapter 25, The Legacy of the Light. Years later, Dr. Mira Singh stood before the United Nations, not as a researcher, but as a director of the Aris Foundation. Behind her, a massive holographic display showed the progress of the global grid, a clean, harmonic energy system based on the hybrid's biological data. The world wasn't perfect. Greed and friction still existed, but the Great Weaving had left a permanent scar on the human psyche, a good one. Every child born after the event knew that the stars weren't just lights in the sky, but neighbors who had reached out to save them from themselves. The observatory in the Western Ghats was now a monument, but Mira rarely visited. She preferred the quiet of the desert, where the sand still held a faint, microscopic trace of emerald dust. She looked up at the night sky, no longer afraid of the dark or the unknown. We're listening now, Aris, she whispered into the wind. The stars didn't answer, but for the first time in human history, they didn't seem so far away. The messenger was gone, but the message of unity, communication, and the fragile beauty of existence was finally being written by humanity itself.